The rain had been coming down in sheets all afternoon, drumming against the windows like a reminder of everything I'd neglected to do. The attic still needed organizing. The old tools in the shed were beginning to rust, and Philip's antique desk, heavy and imposing, remained where it had always been, in the corner of his office. I was 53, but on days like this, I felt much older. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something invisible for too long. It had been 5 years since Philip passed, but his presence lingered in the house, tucked into every corner like the scent of cedar that rose whenever I opened his closet. The truth was, I didn't know why I still lived here. The house was too big for one person, and the constant maintenance overwhelmed me. But leaving felt like abandoning him, like saying goodbye for good. And I wasn't ready for that. This afternoon, I had decided, against my better judgment, that the desk had to go. It had sat untouched for years, the drawers still filled with Philip's papers and pens, the faintest outline of his coffee cup permanently etched into the wood. It wasn't that I wanted to erase him. It was that I needed to reclaim some part of this house for myself. The problem was, the desk was heavy. Too heavy for me to move alone, no matter how much I pushed or pulled. I stood there, staring at the immovable object, the rain pattering on the window behind me. My hair, tied loosely at the nape of my neck, had begun to frizz in the damp air, and my arms ached from trying to lift something that clearly wasn't meant to budge. That's when I heard his voice. "Need some help?" I turned to see Grant standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He looked almost casual, but there was a slight tilt to his head, an edge of amusement in his expression. Grant was Philip's son from his first marriage, a man I had known for years but never really known at all. At 27, he had grown into someone I hardly recognized. Broad-shouldered, tall, with a quiet confidence that had replaced the restless energy I remembered from his younger years. "I didn't mean to bother you," I said, brushing a stray curl from my face. "I just thought I could handle it myself." He smirked, stepping further into the room. "Looks like the desk had other ideas." I couldn't help but laugh, despite myself. "Yeah, well, it always was stubborn." He glanced at the desk, then back at me. "Let me give you a hand." Before I could protest, he moved past me, crouching slightly to examine the base of the desk. The muscles in his arms flexed as he tested the weight, his hands gripping the wood with a familiarity that surprised me. "On 3?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. I nodded, positioning myself on the opposite side. 1, 2, 3. We lifted together, and for a moment, I thought it might actually work. The desk shifted, scraping slightly against the floorboards, but then I faltered, the strain too much for my arms. Grant adjusted immediately, stepping closer to take on more of the weight. His hands brushed against mine as he repositioned his grip, and I felt a jolt of something unexpected. Something that made me acutely aware of how close we were standing. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, concerned. "Fine," I said quickly, though my heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the desk. We managed to move the desk a few feet before setting it down again with a heavy thud. I stepped back, breathing hard, and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound casual. "I couldn't have done that without you." "No problem," he replied, leaning against the edge of the desk. His shirt was slightly damp from the rain outside, clinging to his chest in a way that made me look away, embarrassed by my own wandering thoughts. "You've been tackling a lot of projects lately," he said after a moment. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Just trying to stay busy, I guess." He nodded, but there was a weight to his gaze that made me feel like he could see right through me. "If you ever need anything," he said, "you can ask." His words were simple, but something about the way he said them made my stomach flutter. "Thank you, Grant," I said softly. He smiled then, a small, genuine curve of his lips, and for a fleeting moment, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The days after the desk incident passed quietly, but Grant's presence around the house had become a constant. It started small. He'd repair the squeaky cabinet door in the kitchen, or trim the hedges outside without me asking. I didn't mind. In fact, I found myself looking forward to hearing the low hum of his voice as he worked, or the way his laughter would occasionally drift in from the backyard when he called out a joke to no one in particular. One morning I came downstairs to find him standing in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in hand. He was barefoot, his hair still damp from the shower, and I froze for a moment, caught off guard by how natural he looked there, as though he belonged. "Morning," he said, his lips curling into an easy smile. "Morning," I replied, grabbing my own mug and pouring myself a cup. "Cream and sugar?" he asked, already reaching for the canister. I blinked. "How'd you know?" He shrugged, leaning against the counter. "I pay attention." There was something disarming about the way he said it, casual, but with an undertone that made my stomach flutter. I busied myself with stirring my coffee, focusing on the rhythmic clink of the spoon against the ceramic. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I think I'm getting the hang of this place. It's peaceful here, a nice change of pace." I glanced at him, curious. "From what?" Grant set his mug down, his expression turning serious. "Work, the city. All of it, really. I was burning out." "You never said much about your job," I said, leaning against the opposite counter. "What was it like?" "Demanding," he replied, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "I was in project management. Long hours, constant deadlines, people breathing down your neck. It paid well, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "It wasn't worth it. I needed to get out before it swallowed me whole." His honesty caught me off guard, and I found myself stepping closer, drawn in by the rawness of his words. "That must have been a hard decision," I said softly. "It was," he admitted. "But coming here, it's been good for me. Better than I expected." Our eyes met then, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of us. I felt the warmth of his gaze, steady and unwavering, and my heart skipped a beat. That evening, I joined him in the backyard, where he'd been clearing out the overgrown flower beds. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the grass. I brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and handed one to him as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "You didn't have to do all this," I said, gesturing to the neatly trimmed hedges and freshly dug soil. "I wanted to," he replied simply, taking a sip of his drink. "This place deserves a little love, don't you think?" I nodded, unable to argue. "Philip would have appreciated it." Grant glanced at me, his expression softening. "What about you?" I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "Do you appreciate it?" he asked, his tone gentle but pointed. The question lingered in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have an answer. One Saturday morning, I found myself walking into the garage, looking for a hammer to fix a loose curtain rod. Grant was already there, crouched in front of Philip's old toolbox. He was sorting through the tools, his movements efficient and methodical. "Need something?" he asked without looking up. "A hammer," I said, stepping closer. He handed it to me, his fingers brushing against mine in the exchange. The contact was brief, but it sent a spark up my arm. "Thanks," I murmured, turning to leave. "Wait," he said, standing. "Let me help you." I hesitated, but before I could protest, he followed me into the living room. He made quick work of the curtain rod, his hands steady as he secured the brackets. I watched him from the doorway, noticing the way his shirt clung to his back as he reached up. "There," he said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Good as new." I smiled, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened when he turned to face me. "You're handy to have around." He grinned, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Glad I could help." For a moment we stood there, the silence between us heavy with something unspoken. That evening the rain returned, a soft drizzle that tapped against the windows like a whisper. The power flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and made my way to the living room, where I found Grant sitting on the couch, his face illuminated by the soft, golden glow. "Guess it's just us in the storm," he said, his voice low and warm. I smiled faintly, sitting down beside him. The rain created a cocoon of sound around us, isolating us from the rest of the world. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but it's hard to imagine where I'd go. This house, it's been my whole life for so long." Grant nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight. "I get that. But you deserve more than this." His words hung in the air and I felt my throat tighten. "More than what?" "More than being stuck here, holding on to memories," he said, turning to look at me. "You're not just Philip's widow, Marina, you're so much more than that." I swallowed hard, unable to look away from him. His words were like a key, unlocking something inside me I hadn't realized was locked. "Grant," I began, but my voice faltered. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, but it sent a shiver through me. "I'm sorry," he said softly, pulling his hand back. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I whispered, my voice trembling. Our eyes met, and the air between us seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Slowly he leaned closer, his gaze dropping to my lips. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to stop him, to pull away. But I didn't. It happened the next day in the shed. I had spent the morning going through Philip's old things, sorting tools into neat piles, the smell of sawdust and motor oil hanging heavy in the air. The process should have been cathartic, but it wasn't. Instead, it dredged up old memories, leaving me raw and unsettled. By the time Grant appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, I was on the verge of tears. "You've been at this all morning," he said, stepping inside. "Take a break." "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice cracked slightly. Grant frowned, setting the rag aside. "No, you're not." Before I could protest, he crouched beside me, his eyes scanning my face. "What's wrong?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I held up a small wooden box, the one I'd found buried beneath a pile of Philip's unfinished projects. "It was his," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He was working on it the week before he passed." Grant reached for the box, his fingers brushing mine. He turned it over in his hands, inspecting the half-sanded edges and the faint pencil marks where Philip had sketched out measurements. "He never got to finish it," I added, my throat tightening. Grant set the box down gently, his expression softening. "I'm sorry, Marina." His words, simple as they were, broke something inside me. The tears I'd been holding back spilled over, and I covered my face with my hands, ashamed of my own vulnerability. "Hey," Grant said softly, his hands settling on my shoulders. "It's okay." "I'm sorry," I choked out. "I don't mean to fall apart like this. It's hard, you know? Living with all of this, his things, his memories. Like they're frozen in time. And I'm stuck here, trying to keep it all together." Grant's grip on my shoulders tightened, his touch steady and grounding. "You don't have to keep it together all the time," he said. "It's okay to let yourself feel." I shook my head, fresh tears spilling down my cheeks. "I feel so guilty, like I'm betraying him just by thinking about moving on." Grant's thumbs brushed against my arms, his voice gentle but firm. "You're not betraying him, Marina. You're allowed to live. You're allowed to find happiness again." I looked up at him then, my vision blurry with tears. His face was so close, his expression so open and sincere, that it made my heart ache. "Grant," I began, but the words caught in my throat. He didn't hesitate. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears on my cheeks, and kissed me. At first I froze, too stunned to respond. But then something inside me gave way, and I leaned into him, my hands gripping his arms for support. The kiss was gentle, tentative, but it sent a surge of warmth through me, melting away the cold, hollow ache I'd carried for so long. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested together, and I could feel his breath against my skin. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't help it." I shook my head, my hands trembling. "Don't apologize." We didn't talk much as we walked back to the house. The sun was beginning to set, casting the yard in a warm golden light, but all I could focus on was the way Grant's hand brushed against mine as we walked side by side. When we stepped inside, the house felt different, quieter, heavier. I glanced at Grant, unsure of what to say or do, but he seemed to sense my hesitation. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "I think so." He stepped closer, his gaze searching mine. "If you want me to leave." "Don't," I interrupted, surprising even myself. His eyes softened, and he reached for my hand, his fingers threading through mine. "Are you sure?" I hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. But then I thought about the years I'd spent alone, the nights I'd lain awake in bed, aching for something I couldn't name. And I realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone anymore. "I'm sure," I whispered. He led me upstairs, his hand warm and steady against the small of my back. My heart was racing as we stepped into my bedroom. But when he turned to face me, his expression was so tender, so full of care, that some of my nerves began to fade. "It's just us," he said softly, his hand settling on my waist. "Nothing else matters." I nodded, my breath hitching as he leaned in to kiss me again. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. His lips were warm and firm against mine, and his hands moved to cup my face, his thumbs brushing against my skin with a gentleness that made my heart ache. We moved together slowly, carefully, as though the moment might shatter if we moved too fast. He guided me to the bed, his hands steady as they slid over my arms, my shoulders, my waist. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as someone's widow, or as a woman weighed down by grief, but as myself. And as I lay there with him, his touch soft and reverent, I realized how much I'd missed this, the intimacy, the connection, the feeling of being wanted. When it was over, we lay tangled together in the soft light of the bedside lamp, the sound of our breathing filling the room. Grant's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing slow, lazy circles on my hip. "I don't regret this," he said softly, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his eyes. "I don't either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled then, a small, tender curve of his lips, and I felt something inside me shift. Something that felt a lot like hope. I woke before Grant the next morning. The early light filtered through the curtains, painting soft patterns across the bed. He lay beside me, one arm slung over his forehead, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. For a moment, I simply watched him, my thoughts a tangle of emotions. Part of me wanted to stay in this quiet, stolen moment forever, but another part, a louder, more rational part, reminded me of the lines we'd crossed. I slipped out of bed carefully, wrapping my robe around me as I moved to the window. The yard was still wet from yesterday's rain, the ground glistening in the sunlight. It should have been comforting, this familiar view, but it wasn't. It felt heavy. What had I done? The guilt crept in, sharp and unrelenting. This house, this life, it had all been Philip's, and I had spent years preserving it, keeping it exactly as he'd left it. And now, in the span of one night, I had disrupted everything. But even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't ignore the warmth still lingering in my chest. For the first time in years, I had felt something other than grief. Something alive. Behind me, I heard the soft rustle of sheets. "Marina?" I turned to see Grant sitting up in bed, his hair tousled, his expression half curious, half concerned. "You okay?" I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "Just thinking." "About last night?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Yes." He waited for me to say more, but when I didn't, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood. He crossed the room slowly, stopping just short of me. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said gently. "We'll figure it out, together." We spent the rest of the morning in a kind of fragile quiet. Over breakfast, the conversation stayed light. Small talk about the weather, plans for the day. But there was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared acknowledgement of what had changed. After Grant left to run errands, I found myself wandering back to the shed. The wooden box Philip had been working on sat on the workbench, its unfinished edges catching the light. I ran my fingers over the surface, the grain of the wood rough beneath my touch. I thought about Philip, his steady hands, his quiet laughter, the way he'd always known how to make me feel safe. And then I thought about Grant, the way he'd looked at me last night, not with pity or obligation, but with something real. The past and the present felt like two opposing forces, pulling me in different directions. But as I stood there in the quiet stillness of the shed, I realized I didn't have to choose between them. I could carry both. That evening, Grant surprised me with a gesture I hadn't expected. He had spent the afternoon fixing Philip's project, the wooden box now smooth, sanded, and polished to perfection. "I thought you might want to keep it," he said, handing it to me with a sheepish smile. I took the box carefully, my throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you," I said softly. His gaze met mine, steady and reassuring. "You're allowed to move forward, Marina. It doesn't mean you're forgetting him." I nodded, tears pricking my eyes. "I know." Later, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The future was uncertain, messy, and full of questions I couldn't yet answer. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. Grant reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. I squeezed his fingers lightly, a small smile tugging at my lips. The past would always be a part of me, but so would this moment. And for now, that was enough. The backyard had always been my sanctuary, a place where time seemed to slow, and the world's noise faded into a comforting hush. It had been 3 years since my husband Mark passed away, and though the lawn was still neatly trimmed and the flower beds well tended, the space felt quieter now, almost abandoned. Mark used to spend hours here, pruning the rose bushes and coaxing blooms from the stubborn hydrangeas. I couldn't bring myself to care for them the way he had, though I tried. The hydrangeas hadn't bloomed in 2 summers. I was 58, but some days I felt far older. My reflection in the glass patio door often startled me, silver strands weaving through my once dark hair, the faint lines at the corners of my eyes deepening with each sleepless night. It wasn't just age, it was loneliness too, a weight I carried in silence. My friends said I should join a book club or start volunteering, but the idea of forcing conversation with strangers felt exhausting. I told myself I was content with my routines: morning coffee by the kitchen window, afternoons lost in novels, and evenings sipping chamomile tea as twilight settled over the yard. But tonight, the tea tasted bitter. Or maybe it was just my mood. I had spent the day in a haze, scrolling through old photos of Mark and me on vacations, at family dinners, laughing over some private joke that now felt impossible to recall. I couldn't shake the ache in my chest, the persistent thought that I'd been living in a kind of limbo since his death. The stillness of the house pressed in around me, so I stepped outside, hoping the cool night air might clear my mind. The backyard was dimly lit by the moon, the shadows of the trees casting jagged patterns across the grass. I pulled my cardigan tighter around me and walked toward the garden. That's when I saw him. Ethan, my stepson. He was sitting on the edge of the patio, his long legs stretched out before him, a cigarette glowing faintly in his hand. I stopped short, startled. I hadn't realized he was still awake. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, glancing up at me. His voice was low, a little rough but familiar. I took a cautious step closer, folding my arms across my chest. "I didn't know you smoked." "I don't, not really." He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling upward before dissipating into the night. "Just felt like it tonight." Ethan had come back home 2 months ago, after a messy breakup with a girlfriend whose name I never cared to learn. He'd been distant since Mark's funeral, our interactions reduced to brief phone calls and holiday visits. When he showed up on my doorstep, suitcase in hand, he looked like a ghost of the confident young man I remembered. Thinner, quieter. His once sparkling clouded with something I couldn't quite name. I wasn't sure how to feel about him living here again. He was polite, even kind, but there was a tension between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fact that I wasn't his real mother. I had married Mark when Ethan was already in college, and though he had been warm toward me in those early years, we'd never developed the easy closeness I had hoped for. I hesitated before sitting down on the patio steps a few feet away from him. The night was cooler than I expected, and I tugged my cardigan tighter around me. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the distant fence line. "You?" "Same." We sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a cricket. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, noticing how his hair, damp from a recent shower, curled slightly at the ends. He looked so much like his father in that moment that my chest tightened. "I miss him too," Ethan said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. He didn't look at me, but his words hung heavy in the air. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "I know," I said softly. Another stretch of silence passed, but this one felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I wanted to comfort him, to say something that might bridge the unspoken distance between us, but the words wouldn't come. "I think I'm going to call it a night," I said finally, standing and brushing off my hands. Ethan nodded, flicking the cigarette into the grass and crushing it under his heel. "Good night." As I stepped back into the house, I felt his eyes linger on me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel entirely invisible. The next morning began like any other. I woke early, wrapped myself in my robe, and padded downstairs to brew a pot of coffee. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. I had grown used to this silence, had even come to prefer it. But today, it felt different. Last night's conversation with Ethan lingered in my mind like the faint scent of his cigarette smoke. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when he appeared in the doorway. His hair was slightly mussed, and he was wearing a faded gray t-shirt that clung to his shoulders in a way I couldn't help but notice. He looked younger in the soft morning light, almost boyish. "Morning," he said, his voice low and groggy. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual. He opened the fridge and pulled out the orange juice, drinking straight from the carton. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, too amused by the reminder of how much he was still in some ways the boy I first met years ago. "Want some coffee?" I asked, holding up the pot. He glanced at me, then nodded. "Yeah, thanks." I poured him a mug and slid it across the counter. He took a sip and winced. "God, you like it strong." "It's the only way to drink it," I said, smirking. For a moment, we stood in companionable silence, sipping our coffee. It felt nice. Unexpectedly so. "You were up late last night?" I said, finally, breaking the quiet. He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep. Guess my head's been all over the place lately." I nodded, not wanting to push him. But then he surprised me. "You ever feel like you're just stuck?" he asked, staring down at his mug. "Like you're going through the motions but nothing really means anything?" His words hit me harder than I expected. I set my coffee down, the warmth of the ceramic grounding me. "Yes," I said softly. "I feel that way all the time." He looked up at me then, his expression open and raw in a way that made my chest ache. "How do you deal with it?" I hesitated. How could I explain that I wasn't sure I was dealing with it at all? That some days the only thing keeping me going was sheer habit? "I try to focus on small things," I said finally. "A good book, a walk outside, even just a really good cup of coffee. It doesn't fix everything, but it helps." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me. "Thanks," he said after a moment. The days that followed were marked by small, shared moments like this. Ethan started joining me for breakfast every morning, our conversations growing a little longer each time. At first we talked about safe, surface-level things, news headlines, the weather, whether the hydrangeas might bloom this year. But gradually, the conversations deepened. One morning, he told me about the breakup that had driven him back here. How he'd thought he was going to marry her, only to discover she'd been cheating on him for months. "I felt like such an idiot," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Like I should have seen it coming." "You're not an idiot," I said, my voice firm. "You trusted someone you loved. There's nothing wrong with that." He looked at me, something unreadable in his eyes. "Thanks," he said quietly. Another time, I opened up about my struggles after Mark's death. How hard it had been to find a sense of purpose without him, to figure out who I was on my own. "I thought grief would be this big, dramatic thing," I said. "But it's not. It's quiet. It sneaks up on you in the middle of the night or when you see something that reminds you of them. It's like this constant background hum that never really goes away." Ethan didn't say anything at first, but then he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. His touch was warm, grounding. "You're stronger than you think," he said softly. One afternoon, about a week after our late-night conversation in the backyard, Ethan asked if I wanted to join him by the pool. It was an unusually warm day for early spring, the sun bright and inviting. I hesitated at first. I hadn't worn a swimsuit in years and wasn't sure I wanted to start now. But something in the way he smiled at me, boyish and hopeful, made it hard to say no. I changed into a modest black one-piece, throwing on a loose cover-up for good measure. When I stepped outside, Ethan was already lounging by the water, a pair of sunglasses perched on his nose. He looked effortlessly relaxed, his toned chest and arms catching the sunlight in a way that made my breath hitch. "Thought you weren't going to come," he teased, sitting up as I approached. "I almost didn't," I admitted, settling into the lounge chair beside him. He handed me a glass of iced tea. "Glad you did." We spent the afternoon talking and laughing, the tension between us easing in the warmth of the sun. At one point, I dipped my feet in the water, the coolness a welcome relief against the heat. Ethan joined me, his shoulder brushing against mine as he sat beside me. "You should swim," he said, grinning. "It's amazing." I shook my head. "I'm fine right here." "Come on," he said, standing and offering me his hand. Live a little. Before I could protest, he pulled me to my feet and led me to the edge of the pool. The water was colder than I expected, and I let out a small yelp as it splashed over me. Ethan laughed, his boyish grin lighting up his face. Told you it'd be fun. For a moment, I forgot about everything. The years of grief, the guilt that always seemed to linger at the edges of my mind. All I felt was the sun on my skin, the water lapping at my legs, and Ethan's laughter ringing in my ears. But then his hand brushed against mine, and the moment shifted. I looked up at him, and for a second, the world seemed to tilt. His gaze held mine, something unspoken passing between us. I pulled away, retreating to my lounge chair. My heart was racing, my mind a whirl of confusion and guilt. What was I doing? What was he doing? Later that evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, Ethan joined me. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside me and stared out at the darkened yard. About earlier, he began, his voice hesitant. I shook my head. You don't have to say anything. No, I do, he said, turning to face me. I don't want things to be weird between us. They're not, I said quickly, though my voice betrayed me. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. You sure about that? I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Good night, Ethan, I said, standing and retreating into the house. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way his hand had felt against mine, the way he had looked at me by the pool. And for the first time in years, I felt something other than grief. Something I wasn't ready to name. The days passed, each one carrying with it a subtle shift in the way Ethan and I interacted. There was an undercurrent between us now. A quiet tension that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. I caught him watching me sometimes, his gaze lingering a second too long when I bent to grab something from the lower cabinets, or the way his eyes followed me when I walked into the room. And though I tried to pretend otherwise, I wasn't immune to him either. It wasn't just his looks, though they were undeniably striking. The broad shoulders, the strong jawline, the way his laughter seemed to transform him. It was his presence. He had a way of filling the space around him, making the house feel less empty, less haunted. One evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he wandered in, barefoot and casual. He leaned against the counter, watching me slice vegetables. Smells good, he said, his voice warm. Just spaghetti, I replied, glancing at him briefly. Nothing fancy. Still better than anything I could make. He paused, then added, I don't think I've ever told you how much I appreciate this. Letting me stay here, I mean. I stopped chopping and looked up at him. His expression was serious, his blue eyes soft with sincerity. You don't have to thank me, I said. This is your home too. He smiled, but there was something sad about it. It hasn't felt like home in a long time. Not until now. His words made my chest tighten, a pang of guilt and something else, something warmer, flaring inside me. I turned back to the cutting board, my hands trembling slightly as I resumed slicing. You've been through a lot, I said quietly. So have you. I didn't reply, but the weight of his gaze on me was impossible to ignore. That night, after dinner, I retreated to the porch with a book, hoping to distract myself from the thoughts swirling in my head. But no sooner had I settled into the chair than Ethan appeared, a glass of whiskey in hand. Mind if I join you? He asked. I hesitated, then nodded. Sure. He sat down beside me, the chair creaking slightly under his weight. The air was cool, the faint scent of blooming jasmine carried on the breeze. For a while, we just sat there, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves. What are you reading? He asked eventually. I held up the book so he could see the cover. An old favorite. He leaned closer to get a better look, his shoulder brushing against mine. The warmth of his skin sent a shiver through me, and I forced myself to focus on the book in my lap. You ever feel like you're missing something? He asked suddenly. I looked at him, surprised by the question. What do you mean? He took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze fixed on the darkened yard. I don't know. Like there's this void inside you, and no matter what you do, you can't fill it. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I think everyone feels that way sometimes, I said finally. Especially after losing someone. He nodded, his jaw tightening. Yeah. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something unspoken. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally turned to meet his gaze, I felt a jolt of electricity. "You've been good to me," he said softly. "More than I deserve." My heart was pounding now, my thoughts a chaotic mess. "Ethan?" Before I could finish, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that I froze. "You don't have to keep everything bottled up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay to let someone in." For a moment I considered leaning into him, letting myself give in to the pull I felt. But the weight of guilt was too much, and I stood abruptly, stepping away from him. "I think it's time for me to head to bed," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Ethan didn't try to stop me, but as I walked away, I could feel his gaze following me, and the weight of it lingered long after I closed my bedroom door. The following days were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. I threw myself into chores, organizing the garage, scrubbing the kitchen until it gleamed, anything to keep myself busy. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memory of that night on the porch. The way his touch had ignited something in me I thought long buried. Ethan seemed to sense my retreat, and though he gave me space, I caught glimpses of his frustration. A sigh here, a quiet look there. He wasn't angry, exactly, but I could tell he was waiting for something, for me to address the thing we were both trying so hard to ignore. It wasn't until the stormy night that everything came to a head. The thunderstorm rolled in just after dusk, the first crack of lightning illuminating the darkened sky. The power went out soon after, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer, my pulse quickening as the storm raged outside. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. "Here," he said, stepping into the room with his own flashlight. The beam of light cast shadows across his face, making his features seem sharper, more intense. "Power's out," I said unnecessarily. He smirked, his expression softening. "Yeah, I noticed." We stood there for a moment, the storm rumbling in the background. The air between us felt charged, much like the storm outside. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, though my hands were trembling slightly. "Just, storms make me a little anxious." Without a word, he stepped closer and rested a hand on my arm. The warmth of his touch was grounding, calming, and I found myself leaning into it without thinking. "Come sit with me," he said. He led me to the living room, where we lit a few candles, and settled onto the couch. The flickering light cast a soft glow over the room, making it feel intimate, almost surreal. "Do you remember the camping trips we used to take?" Ethan asked after a while, his voice breaking the silence. I smiled faintly. "Of course." Mark always insisted on making pancakes over the fire, even though they never turned out right. Ethan chuckled. He'd burn the first 3 and then blame the pan. We laughed together, the sound soft and genuine, and for a moment it felt like the past few years of grief and distance had melted away. But then the laughter faded, and the silence returned, heavier this time. Ethan reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm and steady against mine. "Ethan," I began, but he cut me off. "I know," he said softly. "I know this is complicated, but I can't pretend I don't feel something. And I don't think you can either." I stared at him, my heart racing. His words were like a spark, igniting something inside me I'd tried so hard to suppress. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "Then don't say anything," he replied, his voice low and steady. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned in. When I leaned in, the world seemed to hold its breath. The flickering candlelight danced across Ethan's face, his eyes searching mine as if waiting for me to pull back, to retreat, but I didn't. My heart raced, and 100 thoughts screamed in my mind. This was wrong, dangerous, impossible. But none of them were loud enough to drown out the quiet, undeniable truth. I didn't want to stop. When our lips met, it was tentative at first, almost hesitant. His breath was warm, tasting faintly of whiskey and something I couldn't name. I froze, unsure of what to do or what this even meant, but then his hand moved to my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek, and the kiss deepened. For the first time in years, I felt alive. My skin tingled where his fingers trailed along my jawline, and my heart pounded so loudly that I was sure he could hear it. It wasn't just desire, it was a kind of awakening, a surge of emotions I had buried for so long that I'd forgotten they existed. But then, as quickly as it began, reality came crashing back. I pulled away, breathless, my hand instinctively covering my mouth. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We can't. I can't." His brow furrowed, but he didn't move away. "Why not?" he asked softly. "Because," I began, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain the tangled mess of guilt and fear twisting inside me? How could I tell him that I had spent years trying to be the kind of woman people respected, the kind of woman who didn't cross lines like this? "You feel it too," he said, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question. I looked away, tears stinging my eyes. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," he said, his hand still resting lightly on mine. "It matters more than anything." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that this was a mistake. But when I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped ever so slightly as if he were bracing for rejection. And I realized I couldn't deny the truth any longer. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely audible. He reached for my hand again, threading his fingers through mine. "Then let me show you," he said. He kissed me again, and this time I didn't pull away. His touch was gentle but insistent, his hands warm as they slid to my waist. He pulled me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, the tension I had been carrying for years finally beginning to unravel. The rain outside battered against the windows, the storm's fury echoing the storm inside me. Every brush of his lips, every caress of his hands, ignited something I hadn't felt in years, a hunger, a need, a desperate longing to feel connected to another person. "Are you sure?" he whispered against my ear, his breath sending shivers down my spine. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes." He led me upstairs, his hand firm but gentle on my lower back. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the candles we had left behind, their light flickering softly in the stairwell. When we reached my bedroom, I felt a brief pang of doubt, a momentary urge to retreat. But then he turned to me, his expression tender and unguarded, and the doubt dissolved. "I've got you," he said quietly, as if sensing my hesitation. His words were a promise, and I clung to them as he guided me to the bed. The world outside ceased to exist as we came together, the storm a distant backdrop to the quiet, unspoken connection we shared. The details of that night were a blur of sensations, his lips trailing along my collarbone, the warmth of his hands as they explored every inch of me, the way he whispered my name like a prayer. He was attentive, patient, every movement filled with care and intention. I hadn't realized how much I craved this, not just the physical closeness, but the intimacy, the feeling of being seen and wanted. For so long, I had convinced myself that those parts of my life were over, that they had been buried alongside Mark. But Ethan was proving me wrong, showing me that I wasn't as hollow as I had believed. When it was over, we lay tangled together in the dim light, the storm outside finally beginning to subside. His arm was draped across my waist, his breathing slow and steady against my shoulder. I stared at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. "I don't regret this," he said softly, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, his face half hidden in the shadows. "You should." "Do you?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I wanted to say yes, to tell him that this was a mistake and that we could never let it happen again. But I couldn't bring myself to lie. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to my forehead. "Then, that's all that matters." The night stretched on, the two of us cocooned in a fragile, stolen moment that felt like it existed outside of time. But even as I drifted to sleep in his arms, I knew that morning would bring questions and consequences we couldn't avoid. The first thing I noticed when I woke was the silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost oppressive. The faint light of dawn seeped through the curtains, painting the room in muted shades of gray and gold. And then I felt him. Ethan's arm was draped across my waist, his body warm and solid against mine. For a moment, I allowed myself to lie there, to soak in the quiet intimacy of the moment. His breathing was slow and steady, his chest rising and falling against my back. It felt safe, comforting. But as the fog of sleep lifted, reality came rushing back, sharp and unforgiving. The events of the night before played out in my mind with startling clarity. The kiss, the way he'd looked at me, the way I'd let myself fall into him completely. Guilt surged through me, cold and relentless. What had I done? I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to wake him. My robe hung on the back of the door, and I wrapped it around myself like armor as I padded to the window. The backyard was still wet from the storm, the grass glistening in the early morning light. I pressed a hand to the cool glass, my thoughts racing. I had crossed a line, one I couldn't uncross. What would Mark think if he were here? What would people say if they knew? But beneath the guilt was something else, something I was afraid to name. A part of me felt alive. For the first time in years, I had felt wanted, desired, seen. That part of me whispered that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as broken as I'd believed. Behind me, I heard the rustle of sheets, followed by the soft creak of the bed. "Morning," Ethan said, his voice rough with sleep. I turned to face him, my heart clenching at the sight of him sitting there, his hair mussed and his eyes still heavy-lidded. He looked younger like this, almost boyish, but there was a softness in his expression that made it clear he wasn't naive about what had happened between us. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "Are you okay?" I hesitated, my hands tightening around the sash of my robe. "I don't know," I admitted. Ethan stood and crossed the room, his movements slow and deliberate. When he reached me, he hesitated for a moment before placing a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to feel guilty," he said softly. I met his gaze, my throat tightening. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "What happened last night, it wasn't wrong. It wasn't planned, but it wasn't wrong either." I wanted to believe him, but the weight of years of social expectations and moral lines felt like a noose around my neck. "It's complicated," I said, looking away. Ethan sighed, his hand dropping to his side. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now, He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I just want you to know that I don't regret it. Not for a second." His words hung in the air, heavy and bittersweet. As he turned to leave, I called out to him, my voice trembling. "Ethan?" He stopped, glancing back at me. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" "For reminding me that I'm still alive." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, before stepping out of the room. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the backyard. The storm had passed, but the ground was still wet, the air still heavy with the scent of rain. I didn't know what the future held, whether this was the beginning of something or the end. But for the first time in years, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. And for now, that was enough.
Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, torn between my loyalty to my husband and the unsettling reality of what had just happened. But life has a way of throwing you into moments you never saw coming. Moments that force you to question everything you thought you knew about trust, respect, and even yourself. It all started on a cool autumn evening. My husband, Henry, had invited a few colleagues over for dinner. It wasn't unusual. Henry had worked at his firm for nearly 20 years, and over time I had come to know many of his coworkers well. Some had become friends, people I'd exchange holiday cards with, and make small talk at company events. But one of them, Michael, was different. Michael was relatively new at the company, having joined about a year ago. He was younger than Henry, maybe early 40s, confident, and undeniably charming in that effortless way that made people gravitate toward him. He had a way of making every conversation feel like an inside joke, every compliment sound like a secret meant just for you. I never gave it much thought until that night. We had a beautiful dinner planned. The house smelled of rosemary and garlic from the roasted chicken in the oven, and I had even lit some candles to give the place a warm, inviting glow. Henry was in his element, laughing and chatting with his coworkers while I played the role of the gracious host, making sure drinks were refilled and everyone was comfortable. Michael arrived a little later than the others, carrying a bottle of wine and his usual confident grin. "Hope I'm not too late to the party," he said, handing me the wine as his fingers brushed over mine, just a little longer than necessary. I ignored the momentary discomfort, chalking it up to my imagination. The evening carried on, and as the drinks flowed, the conversations grew livelier. Henry was deep in discussion with his boss about an upcoming project, and I found myself stuck in a conversation with Michael. He was charming as always, but there was something else beneath his words tonight, something heavier, more pointed. "You know, Aurora," he said, his voice smooth, "I have to say, Henry is a lucky man. I laughed politely, brushing off the comment. Well, I'd like to think I'm lucky too. Michael leaned in slightly, his gaze steady. If I were him, I don't think I'd ever leave your side. There it was, that unmistakable shift in tone. My stomach tightened. I think he feels the same way, I said lightly, hoping to steer the conversation away. But Michael wasn't backing down. As the night went on, his comments became bolder, small, seemingly harmless re-Henrys that, when pieced together, painted a picture of something far more intentional, a touch on my arm that lingered too long, a glance that felt too heavy, a quiet re-Henry whispered just close enough to my ear that it sent an unwanted shiver down my spine. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was the wine, maybe it was just Michael's natural charm. But when the night ended and Henry walked the last of the guests to the door, Michael hung back for a moment. It was nice spending time with you tonight, he said. His voice was lower now, his expression unreadable. I hope we get to do this again, maybe just the two of us sometime. My breath caught for a moment. I wasn't sure I had heard him correctly, but the look in his eyes, the slight smirk on his lips told me I had. Before I could say anything, Henry returned, clapping Michael on the back. Glad you could make it, buddy. Drive safe. Michael only smiled, his eyes flickering back to mine for a brief second before he turned and walked out the door. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding. Had that really just happened? I barely registered Henry's voice as he locked up for the night, his tone light and unaware. That went well, don't you think? Everyone seemed to have a good time. I forced a smile. Yeah, it was a good night. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something had changed, and deep down I knew this wasn't over. I woke up the next morning with a strange heaviness in my chest. The house was quiet except for the distant hum of Henry in the kitchen, probably making his usual Saturday morning coffee. I told myself I was overthinking it, that Michael was just being his usual overly charming self, and I had read too much into his words. But no matter how many times I tried to dismiss it, the memory of his voice, the look in his eyes, the way his fingers had lingered on mine, it all stuck to me like a shadow. I pushed the thoughts aside and got out of bed, wrapping myself in my robe before heading downstairs. Morning, hon, Henry said with a smile as he handed me a steaming mug of coffee. Sleep okay? Yeah, I lied taking a sip. He didn't notice my hesitation, already moving on to his next thought. Oh, by the way, Michael texted me this morning, he said. He had a great time last night and wants to get together again soon. I nearly choked on my coffee. Henry didn't seem to notice. I told him we should do a double date, maybe dinner at that new steakhouse downtown. I hesitated. Every part of me wanted to say no, to come up with an excuse, any reason to avoid being in the same room with Michael again. But what was I supposed to do? Tell my husband that his colleague had crossed a line, that I wasn't sure what his intentions were, but they made me uncomfortable? I didn't even have proof, just a feeling. So instead, I forced a smile. That sounds nice. Henry grinned. Great, I'll set it up. The following week, I did my best to forget about the whole thing. I kept myself busy, throwing myself into errands, catching up with old friends, and doing anything that kept my mind from drifting back to Michael. But then, out of nowhere, I got a text. Michael, hey Aurora, hope you're having a great day. Can't stop thinking about our conversation the other night. My stomach twisted. I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I could have ignored it, should have ignored it, but part of me wanted to make it clear that whatever he thought was happening wasn't. Hey Michael, I think you might have misunderstood something. I'm happily married, and I'd appreciate it if you kept things professional. I hit send and let out a breath, hoping that would be the end of it. Seconds later, my phone buzzed again. Michael, of course Aurora, I respect that. Just saying, if things were different. I clenched my jaw. It wasn't stopping. I didn't respond. The double date happened 2 days later. I considered canceling, coming up with some excuse, but I didn't want to raise suspicion, so I went, wearing a simple navy dress and my best attempt at a relaxed expression. Michael and his wife Rachel were already seated when we arrived. Rachel was sweet, soft-spoken, kind, the type of woman who looked at her husband like he was her whole world. It made my stomach churn. Michael was as smooth as ever, making jokes, keeping the conversation lively, acting as if nothing had ever happened. But I caught it, the quick glances when no one was looking, the way his knee brushed mine under the table, the way he leaned in just a little too close when handing me the wine bottle. I felt trapped. And then, at one point in the evening, while Rachel and Henry were talking, Michael murmured just low enough for only me to hear, "You're even more beautiful when you're nervous." I froze. My pulse pounded in my ears, my body tensing as I turned to look at him. He smirked, so subtle it was barely noticeable. I had two choices: let it slide, pretend it didn't happen like I had before, or stop this right now. I took a deep breath, then spoke loud enough for Henry and Rachel to hear. Michael, I don't think it's appropriate for you to talk to me like that. Silence fell over the table. Henry's head snapped up. Rachel blinked in confusion. And Michael just stared at me, his smirk vanishing as he realized what I had done. Henry frowned. What, Michael? Michael let out a small, forced laugh. It was just a joke. It didn't feel like one, I said evenly. Rachel looked between us, her brow furrowing. Michael. He shook his head quickly, putting on a smile. Just a misunderstanding. Let's not make this awkward. But it was already awkward, and I didn't care. Henry looked at me confused but concerned. Aurora, are you okay? I met his eyes, and for the first time, I let him see the truth. I don't think I want to be here anymore, I admitted. Henry didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded and stood. Then let's go. Michael opened his mouth as if to say something, but I didn't wait to hear it. I grabbed my purse, gave Rachel an apologetic look, and walked out of the restaurant with my husband by my side. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was for sure. This wasn't over yet. The car ride home was quiet. Henry kept glancing at me, waiting for me to say something, but I just stared out the window, my thoughts tangled. Finally, as we pulled into the driveway, he spoke. Aurora, what happened back there? I exhaled, gripping my purse tighter. Tom, how to say this without it sounding wrong? Try me. His voice was gentle, but there was a trace of something else beneath it, concern, maybe even anger. I turned to him, choosing my words carefully. Michael has been making me uncomfortable. Henry's brow furrowed. What do you mean? I swallowed hard. That night after dinner at our place, he was too familiar. The way he touched my hand, the way he looked at me. I brushed it off as nothing, but then he texted me a few days later saying he couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. Henry's hands tightened on the steering wheel. And tonight, I continued, he said something inappropriate to me. I tried to handle it on my own, but I realized if I kept quiet, it would never stop. Henry's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white. Aurora, why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, I admitted, and because he's your colleague, I didn't want to make trouble for you at work. Henry shook his head, his eyes dark with something I rarely saw, fury. You are my wife. You come first, always. His words made my chest tighten, and for the first time that night, I felt like I could breathe. But this wasn't over. The next morning, I woke up to find Henry already in the kitchen, his phone in his hand, his expression tense. What's wrong? I asked. He let out a slow breath. Michael texted me. He's trying to act like nothing happened, said he hopes last night didn't cause any unnecessary drama. I scoffed. Unnecessary drama? Unbelievable. Henry looked at me. I don't want you to have to deal with this anymore. I'm going to talk to him at work, face to face. I hesitated. Are you sure? He crossed a line, Aurora, Henry said firmly, more than once. I need to make it clear that this is not okay. Something in his voice told me he wasn't going to let this go, and honestly, I was relieved. That afternoon, while Henry was at work, I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, that Michael wasn't just going to walk away from this quietly. And I was right. Around 3 p.m., my phone buzzed. Michael, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Can we talk? Just the two of us. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't reply. A few minutes later, another message. Michael, come on, Aurora. Let's be adults about this. I gritted my teeth, my heart pounding at the audacity. I blocked his number, then I called Henry. When Henry came home that evening, he looked exhausted but determined. What happened? I asked as he set his briefcase down. He ran a hand through his hair. I confronted him. I tensed, and Henry exhaled sharply. At first, he tried to act like it was all a joke, that I was overreacting, but I made it clear he is never to contact you again ever. And if he so much as looks at you the wrong way, I'll make sure our boss knows exactly what kind of person he is. I bit my lip. And he just accepted that? Henry's expression darkened. Not at first. He got defensive, said I was being ridiculous, that you were overreacting. But I told him I trusted you completely, and that was the end of the discussion. I felt a lump rise in my throat. You really did that? Of course I did, he said softly. Aurora, I will always stand up for you. You should never have to deal with something like this alone. A rush of emotion hit me. For days, I had felt trapped, unsure of how to handle the situation, worried about how it would affect Henry. But now, standing in our home, hearing the unwavering certainty in his voice, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, safe. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tight. "Thank you." His lips pressed against the top of my head. "You never have to thank me for protecting you." And for the first time in days, I truly believed him. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling Michael wasn't the type to back down easily, and I wasn't sure this was really over. I wanted to believe it was over, that Henry's warning had been enough to make Michael back off for good, but deep down I knew better. And I was right. 2 days later, I was in the grocery store, pushing my cart down the produce aisle, when I felt it, a presence, a shadow lingering just a little too close. I turned and my stomach dropped. Michael. He stood a few feet away, casually inspecting a row of apples, like he just happened to be there. But I knew better. The store was across town from his office. He had no reason to be here. My pulse quickened. I thought about leaving, but something in me refused to let him see my fear. I squared my shoulders, reached for a bag of oranges, and acted like he wasn't there. But of course, he didn't take the hint. "Aurora," he said smoothly, "fancy seeing you here." I didn't respond. He stepped closer. "No need to be rude. After all, I think there's been a little misunderstanding between us." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "There's no misunderstanding, Michael. You crossed a line, and you need to stay away from me." His smile faltered. "Come on now. No need to be dramatic." Dramatic. My voice was low firm. "Texting me after I blocked your number, showing up here? That's not normal, Michael." His expression darkened, and for the first time, I saw it. The mask slipping. "You know," he said, tilting his head, "Henry's a lucky guy. You should be careful, Aurora. A woman like you attract attention. Not all of it good." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just persistence. This was a warning. I met his gaze, refusing to let him see my fear. "Are you threatening me?" Michael held up his hands, that smug smirk returning. "Not at all. Just making an observation." I turned and walked away, my hands shaking. I abandoned my cart and went straight to my car, locking the doors the second I got inside. My phone was already in my hand before I even realized I had grabbed it. I called Henry. Henry came home earlier than usual that evening. He was livid. "He followed you?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Yes," I said, "and he wasn't just being creepy, Henry. He was trying to scare me." Henry exhaled sharply, pacing the kitchen. "That's it. I'm done playing nice." I swallowed. "What are you going to do?" He met my eyes. "I'm going to our boss, and if that doesn't work, I'm going to HR. Michael doesn't get to do this. Not to you, not to anyone." For the first time since this started, I felt something shift inside me. A weight lifted, because I wasn't alone in this. Michael had tried to make me feel powerless, but I wasn't, not anymore. The next day, Henry filed a formal complaint with HR. Michael must have realized he pushed too far because by the end of the week, he had resigned from the company. Word spread fast, something about personal reasons and new opportunities elsewhere. But Henry and I knew the truth. He was gone, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe again. That weekend, Henry and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset. "You okay?" he asked, his fingers lacing through mine. I nodded. "Yeah, I think I finally am." Henry exhaled, rubbing his thumb over my hand. "I should have seen it sooner. I cut him off. No, he was the problem, not you. And he stood by me when I needed him most. That's what matters." He pulled me closer, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "Always." I smiled, resting my head on his shoulder. This whole ordeal had been a nightmare, but it had also taught me something important about myself, about Henry, about the strength we had together. Michael had tried to shake me, but in the end, all he had done was remind me just how strong I really was.